The call to prayer came before the light. It always did. In Istanbul in the year 1540, the first ezan of the day, the Fajr, the dawn prayer, rose from the minarets before the sky had decided what color it was going to be, while the city was still dark and the Bosphorus was still the same black as the sky above it, the two darknesses meeting somewhere out in the strait where you could not quite see. The muezzin's voice carried in the cold air the way voices carry in cold air, farther than expected, cleaner than expected, the sound sharpened by the temperature into something that was less a sound than a presence. Fatma heard it without waking. She had heard it every morning of her 43 years. The call had become the mechanism of her sleep rather than the interruption of it, the sound that told her body there were still a few minutes before she had to move, before the day started, before the house came to life around her. She lay still. The Bosphorus was outside. She could not see it from this room, but she had lived near the water for most of her adult life, and she felt it the way you feel things that have organized your experience. As a kind of pressure, a quality in the air, the faint smell of cold salt that was always there at this hour, beneath the wood smoke and the bread and the accumulated smell of a city of 700,000 people beginning to wake. 700,000 people. Istanbul in the reign of Sultan Suleiman, the man his people called Kanuni, the lawgiver, the man the Europeans called Suleiman the Magnificent, was one of the largest cities on earth. It was larger than London, which at this moment was a city of perhaps 100,000, still a generation away from the Elizabethan expansion that would make it important. It was larger than Paris. It was larger than Venice, which was the commercial capital of the Mediterranean world and considered itself the center of civilization, and was wrong about that in the specific way that cities which have recently been the center of things tend to be wrong about still being the center of things. Istanbul was the center. The Ottomans knew it. The city knew it. And Fatma, who was a bread seller's wife, and who had never thought about the city's position in the hierarchy of civilizations, knew it in the way that inhabitants of great cities always know it. Not as a fact about the world, but as a fact about themselves, a quiet conviction that the place where you are is the place that matters. Welcome to Dull Tales. If you found your comfortable position, good. Stay there. Tonight we're going to Istanbul. The Istanbul of 500 years ago, the city that sat on the edge between Europe and Asia and decided, quietly, that it didn't need to choose. This is going to be a long evening. We're going to move through the city the way the city moved, slowly, with attention, through the fog that came off the Bosphorus in the morning, and the smell of the spice market in the afternoon, and the particular blue that the light went over the domes and the minarets before the evening prayer. We'll spend time with Fatma, who sells bread in the Eminönü quarter and knows everyone who walks past her stall. We'll spend time with Ibrahim, her husband, a baker whose hands have been flour white for 20 years. We'll spend time with Murad, a young scribe from Anatolia in his first year at the palace Chancery, trying to understand a city that is too large and too complicated for any single mind. And we'll spend time with the widow Hafsa, who is 71 years old and who has lived through 3 sultans and who considers the current one adequate. Leave a comment when you're settled. I read every one, and if you're new here, the subscribe button will find you. Now, back to Fatma and the call to prayer and the last few minutes before the day begins. She rose. The sequence was so practiced that it required no thought. The quilt folded back in a specific way, the feet finding the cold floor, the shawl from the hook by the door. The cold of an Istanbul morning in October was a particular kind of cold, not the deep cold of the Anatolian plateau, which was something else entirely, but the wet, penetrating cold of a city surrounded on 3 sides by water, a cold that got into the joints and stayed. Fatma moved through it the way you move through cold that you know, quickly, with the specific economy of someone who has not yet generated enough warmth to afford to stand still. She went to the kitchen. The kitchen in their house was on the ground floor, as all the practical rooms were. The upper floors were for sleeping and sitting. The ground floor was for working. The house was in the Eminönü district, near the Egyptian Bazaar, in the dense commercial neighborhood that crowded around the Golden Horn and that never entirely slept. Even at this hour, before the full day had started, she could hear the first stirrings of the waterfront, the sound of the fishing boats, the creak of the wooden piers, the distant call of a vendor whose particular commodity required an early start. She started the fire. This was the first thing, before anything else. The cold hearth had to be coaxed back to life with the embers she had banked the night before, the small miracle of preserved heat that was the household's continuity through the night. She added the wood in the specific sequence that produced the fastest result. The thin pieces first, the larger pieces once the flame was established, the waiting that was not passive but alert, the small adjustments that turned a tentative flame into a working fire. Ibrahim was still asleep. He would sleep until the dough had risen and the first batch was ready to go into the oven, and then he would appear in the kitchen with the particular purposefulness of a man whose body had organized itself around the rhythms of the trade, waking not to an alarm or a sound, but to an internal clock set to the dough's readiness. This was his gift, and occasionally, his limitation. He slept through things that were not dough. The city of Istanbul was built on 3 hills and organized around water. The Bosphorus to the east, the strait that connected the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, the channel that was the most strategically significant waterway in the world. A fact that the city had understood since Constantine moved the Roman capital here in 330 CE, and that the Ottoman sultans understood when Mehmed II took the city in 1453, and made it the heart of an empire that stretched from Hungary to the Persian frontier. The Golden Horn to the north, the inlet of the Bosphorus that formed the city's natural harbor, the curved waterway around which the commercial life of the city organized itself, the place where the boats came in with their loads of grain and spice and timber, and everything else that a city of 700,000 needed to survive. The Sea of Marmara to the south, the city on its peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides and by the great walls of Theodosius on the 4th. Those walls, they had kept the city safe for 1,000 years, from the 5th century until the morning in 1453 when the Ottoman cannon reduced them to manageable rubble. The walls were still there, still massive, still impressive, still the boundary between the city proper and the land beyond. But they were now the walls of a city at peace, or at least at the particular peace that comes from being the strongest power for a considerable radius, and they were slowly being incorporated into the fabric of the city itself. The houses of the poor built against their inner faces, the gardens planted at their feet. The city that Fatma knew was not the city of the palace Topkapi, on the first hill, looking out over the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn simultaneously, the compound of courts and gardens and pavilions where Suleiman the Magnificent was, at this moment, dealing with an empire that stretched across 3 continents and a number of administrative problems that would give a less disciplined man significant headaches. Her city was the city of the commercial districts, the neighborhoods, the market streets, the water carriers and the bread sellers and the guild members, and the imam of the neighborhood mosque, and the coffee house that had opened just 2 years ago, and that was still, to the older generation, a suspicious novelty. The coffee house question was one of the topics that Istanbul in 1540 had genuine opinions about. Coffee had come to Istanbul relatively recently, from Yemen, through Cairo, spreading through the Ottoman commercial network in the way that things spread through commercial networks, faster than official institutions would like, attached to the social practices that adoption requires, arriving before the theology and the law had decided what to do with it. The coffee houses, the kahvehanes, were places where men gathered to drink a bitter dark liquid that had a stimulating effect on the mind, and that some of the religious scholars found theologically problematic. Was it intoxicating? Scholars who said yes were overruled, eventually, by the scholars who said no, and by the fact that the coffee houses had become too embedded in the city's social life to remove without considerable disruption. They were extraordinary places, not simply for the coffee, though the coffee was the occasion. They were places where men of different classes and occupations mixed with a freedom that the more formal social structures of the city did not permit. The small craftsman sat beside the government official. The student from the madrasa argued with the merchant from the bazaar. News moved through the coffee houses faster than it moved through any official channel. Gossip was the medium, and the medium was the message. In the coffee house, you learned what was actually happening in the city, which was not always what the official accounts said was happening. Ibrahim went to the coffee house after the morning baking, when the first rush of the day was done and the bread was in the ovens and the work had settled into its midday rhythm. He went every day, or nearly every day, with the regularity of someone who understood that the coffee house was not a luxury but a professional necessity. You learned things there, you maintained relationships, you kept current with the life of the trade. Fatma did not go to the coffee house. It was a male social space. But she had opinions about what her husband learned there and brought home, and she conveyed them with the directness of a woman who understood that managing information was as important as acquiring it. The bazaar opened after the morning prayer. Not all at once the great bazaar, the Kapali Sarshi, the grand bazaar that would one day be the most visited tourist attraction in the world, opened in stages, the fabric merchants first, then the jewelers, then the spice dealers, then the small craftsmen who needed light to work by. The sequence was established by custom and by the logic of the trade. You opened when you were ready, when your goods were set out, and your fire was lit, and your first customers of the day were the kind of customers whose business you wanted. The Egyptian bazaar, the Mesur Sarshisi, the spice bazaar near Eminönü, was Fatma's immediate territory. She did not have a stall inside the bazaar itself. Her stall was on the street outside, one of the dozens of small sellers who worked the approaches to the great markets, positioned to catch the traffic moving toward the bazaar entrance. She sold bread. She had been selling bread at this corner for 12 years. Everyone who used this entrance to the bazaar regularly knew her face, her prices, and the fact that her bread was worth slightly more than the bread sold 3 stalls down, because Ibrahim baked it and Ibrahim was a good baker. The bread she sold was not the bread of wealthy households. That bread was bought from specialist bakers who produced the finer white loaves that required sieved flour and more care and more fuel, and consequently cost more. Her bread was the bread of the city's working majority, the round, dark, substantial loaves of mixed wheat and other grain that were the caloric foundation of Istanbul's enormous working population. The bread that the porter ate after carrying loads up the hill from the waterfront. The bread that the rope maker ate before starting his 12-hour day in the workshop. The bread that the water carrier ate between his circuits of the neighborhood. In Istanbul in 1540, bread was bread in the same way that the Nile was the Nile. Not simply a food, but the organizing principle of nutrition, the baseline from which everything else was calculated, the thing that, when it was absent, meant everything had gone wrong. Murad had been in Istanbul for 8 months. He was 23 years old, from a small city in central Anatolia, the son of a minor provincial official who had recognized in him a capacity for the scribal work that the Ottoman bureaucratic machine required in large quantities and had arranged, through connections that had cost something and would need to be repaid, an appointment to the imperial Chancery. The Chancery was not a glamorous position. It was the production floor of the Ottoman state's paperwork, the thousands of documents that the empire required to function, the orders and certificates and registrations and correspondence that moved from Istanbul outward to the provinces and back inward, with the reports that the provinces sent. Murad copied and drafted and sealed and dispatched, 8 hours a day in a room with 20 other scribes, supervised by a chief scribe who had been doing this work for 30 years and had very specific opinions about the correct formation of the Ottoman chancellery hand. He was homesick. This was not surprising. Istanbul was overwhelming in a way that a small Anatolian city was not, and 8 months had not been long enough to stop being overwhelmed. The scale of the city was the first problem. He had grown up in a place where you knew, more or less, where everything was. Istanbul defeated this expectation entirely. It was a city of hills and valleys and water, and sudden open squares and narrow streets that went nowhere, and enormous open areas that turned out to be the courtyards of mosques he had not known were there. He got lost regularly. He had decided to treat this as education rather than failure, which was the right decision but required daily recommitment. The second problem was the people. Istanbul in 1540 was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, not cosmopolitan in the modern sense of a certain kind of cultivated international openness, but cosmopolitan in the older sense of actually containing many peoples. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Venetian merchants, Genoese merchants, Egyptian merchants, Persians, Arabs, Slavs from the Balkans, Hungarians, the occasional Englishman looking slightly lost. All of these people moved through the same streets and the same bazaars, and conducted their business in an improvised multilingual commerce that Istanbul had been developing for 200 years, and that had produced a kind of practical fluency, not in any single additional language, but in the commercial Turkish, that was everyone's second language and that served. Murad found this exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. He was a boy from a provincial Turkish city, and the Greek fishermen at the waterfront confused him, and the Jewish money changers in the Grand Bazaar knew things about exchange rates that he did not know, and the Armenian craftsmen in the metalwork district made things whose beauty he appreciated without understanding, and he walked home from work each evening feeling that the city was too large for him, and that he was in the process of growing to fit it. This process would take some time. The water system of Istanbul was one of the engineering achievements of the age. The city's population required water on a scale that the local springs and wells could not provide, and the Ottoman administration had solved this problem with the same combination of ambition and practical competence that characterized the imperial project generally. The great aqueducts and waterways that brought water from the hills west of the city, the hundreds of cisterns that stored it, the elaborate distribution network of lead pipes and stone channels and public fountains that got it to the neighborhoods. The public fountain, the Çeşme, was one of the characteristic institutions of Ottoman urban life. Every neighborhood had one. They were often beautiful. The larger ones were architectural statements, covered in carved marble, inscribed with the name of the sultan or official who had paid for them, endowed with the permanence and the aesthetic aspiration that the Ottomans brought to public infrastructure. The smaller ones were simpler but no less functional. A stone basin, a spigot, the water flowing constantly in the fashion that Ottoman hydraulic engineering permitted, the waste water running away in channels to the drains. The water carrier, the saka, was a figure of the city, a man with a great leather bag or ceramic jug, who filled it at the fountain and carried it on his back to the houses and workshops and coffee houses that paid for the delivery. The saka had his roots, his customers, his established price, his guild, because in Ottoman Istanbul, everyone who did anything had a guild, and the guild was the institution that organized the trade, set the standards, protected the members, and gave the occupation its particular identity and its relationship to the state. Murad saw Sakalar every day. He saw the guild of the water carriers and the guild of the bread sellers, and the guild of the spice merchants, and the guild of the rope makers and the guild of the scribes, his own guild, the esnaf of the Chancery, and the guilds of the butchers and the candle makers and the cobblers and the boat builders and the fish sellers, and dozens of others that he had not yet learned to identify. The guilds were the city's skeleton, the structure beneath the visible flesh of commerce and daily life, the institution that connected the individual craftsman to the state and the market and the tradition and the community of his trade. He was beginning to understand this. He was not finished understanding it. He thought he might never be finished. Fatma's bread stall was open from the morning prayer until the afternoon prayer. This was the rhythm of the city's commerce. The day divided by the calls to prayer into segments that were also commercial units, the time between prayers being the time of business, the prayers themselves being the brief pauses in which the city collected itself. The noon prayer Zuhr was the longest break, the one that corresponded to the midday meal and the heat of the day, when the city that was not closed for prayer was at least quieter. The afternoon prayer Asr was when the commerce resumed and ran until the evening prayer Maghrib, at which point the bazaars closed and the city shifted into its other mode. The customers at Fatma's stall were the same customers, day after day, with the regularity of people whose roots were established. The apprentice from the metalwork workshop, buying 2 loaves before his master arrived. The widow from the neighboring street, who bought 1 loaf and sometimes stopped to talk for several minutes, which was information exchange as much as it was conversation. The Jewish merchant from the Grand Bazaar, who passed this way every morning and whose Turkish was excellent and who had been buying from her stall for 6 years and who she respected without being certain she understood. The water carrier, one of the Sakaler whose route passed this corner, who bought half a loaf quickly, standing, eating as he moved. She knew them all. Their names, their households, their current situations, who had a sick child, who had recently had an argument with a neighbor, who was short of money this week and might need credit, and who had credit already and was reliably paying it back. This knowledge was not gossip. It was the operating system of the neighborhood's economic network, and Fatma maintained it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her ability to offer credit, to extend or withhold the small economic mercy of waiting for payment, was as important to her business as the quality of the bread. She was, without using the word, a neighborhood financier. Many of the small-scale women's commercial networks in Ottoman cities were the bread seller, the textile dealer, the woman who operated a small-scale lending operation from her house. The Ottoman legal system gave women property rights and the ability to conduct commercial transactions, and women in Ottoman cities used these rights with a pragmatism that the historical record, where it is detailed enough to show us, consistently reveals. The Süleymaniye Mosque was under construction. This was the great project of the age, the mosque complex that Suleiman the Magnificent was building on the 3rd hill of Istanbul, the complex that would include not just the mosque itself but a hospital, a school, a library, an emirate for feeding the poor, a caravanserai, a bazaar, the whole charitable and educational and commercial organism that Ottoman architecture organized around the mosque as its center. The architect was Sinan. Sinan, who was in his 40s in 1540 and who had already built more than most architects build in a lifetime, and who would go on to build for another 40 years, accumulating a body of work, the Süleymaniye, the Şehzade, and the Selima in Edirne, which many considered his masterpiece, that made him perhaps the greatest architect in the history of Ottoman civilization. Sinan had begun as a military engineer. He had built bridges and fortifications and siege equipment in the campaigns of Suleiman's army, and he had learned, in the field, the engineering of stone under pressure and water under management, and the structural logic that made the difference between a building that stood and a building that did not. When he turned to mosque architecture, he brought this engineering mind to the theological problem of how to make a sacred space, how to create the sense of immensity and light that the dome produced, how to manage the forces that the dome put on its supports, how to make a building that felt both vast and intimate, both monumental and human. He was solving these problems in 1540 on the 3rd hill of Istanbul. The construction site was visible from much of the city, the scaffolding and the workshops and the cranes and the enormous organized confusion of a building project of this scale. Thousands of workers, stone from Marmara, the pale marble that would face the mosque's exterior, lead for the dome covering, the glaziers for the tiles and the windows, the calligraphers for the inscriptions, the woodworkers for the minbars and doors. Murad passed the construction site on his route to and from the Chancery. He stopped, sometimes, to look at it, not with the professional eye of a builder, but with the unguarded eye of a young man from the provinces who had not yet become accustomed to being in a place where things this large were made. He could not see what it would look like when it was done. He had never seen anything like what it would be. But he could see the scale of the intention, and the scale was impressive in a way that made the intention legible even at this stage. He walked on. The files he was carrying needed to be at the Chancery before noon. The food of Istanbul was the food of an empire. This is not a boast. It is a description of what happened when the commercial networks of a large empire all pointed toward a single city. The spices that came through the Egyptian bazaar, the pepper, the cinnamon, the cloves, the nutmeg, the turmeric, the cardamom, had traveled from the Indian Ocean trade network through the Red Sea and Egypt, been taxed and traded along the way, and arrived at the Misr Sarshasi in quantities that made them available to anyone in Istanbul who could afford them. The grain came from Egypt and Anatolia and the Black Sea ports. The Black Sea grain trade was one of the Ottoman Empire's most important economic systems, the ships moving south through the Bosphorus with the wheat and the barley that fed the city's enormous population. The fish came out of the Bosphorus itself, which was then one of the most abundant fishing waters in the Mediterranean basin. The great schools of bluefish and mackerel and tuna and bonito that moved through the strait twice a year. The autumn migration in particular being a harvest of such abundance that the city organized itself around it. Fatma's cooking was the cooking of an Istanbul household of her class and era, not the elaborate cuisine of the palace kitchens, where Suleiman's chefs produced dishes of extraordinary complexity, but the practical cooking of a household that ate well because the raw materials were available and because she knew what to do with them. She cooked lamb when they could afford it. She cooked fish, often the Bosphorus fish, fresh from the morning's catch, brought up from the waterfront by the fish sellers. She cooked vegetables, the eggplant, the peppers, the onions and tomatoes that were, some of them, relatively recent arrivals from the New World, brought to the Ottoman Empire through the Venetian trade networks and not yet fully integrated into the cuisine but beginning to be. She made pilav, the rice dish that had come from Persia, and that was one of the distinguishing technologies of Ottoman cooking, the specific way of washing and soaking and cooking rice until each grain was separate and the whole was both light and substantial. She cooked with spices, not in the overwhelming quantities of some cuisines, but with the specific touch of a cook who understood that a small amount of the right spice did something that a large amount of any spice could not. The cinnamon in the lamb, the cumin in the legume stew, the allspice in the stuffed vegetables. This is the Ottoman cooking tradition, not the subordination of the ingredient to the spice, but the enhancement of the ingredient by the right addition, the thing that made the food specific rather than merely good. The widow Hafsa lived 2 streets from Fatma's stall. She was 71 years old, which was genuinely old in a city where the average life expectancy, when you averaged across the entire population including the high infant mortality, was considerably lower. She had outlived her husband by 20 years, her eldest son by 12, and 2 sultans. She had been born in the reign of Bayezid II, grown to adulthood under Selim I, the grim, brilliant Selim who had conquered Egypt and Syria and the holy cities in 8 years, and who had the habit of executing officials who displeased him with a frequency that made his court unusually attentive, and was now, in her old age, living through the reign of Suleiman, whom she considered capable but perhaps too fond of his own grandeur. She was not afraid of having this opinion. She was 71 and had outlived most people she knew, and the opinions that survive that process tend to have a certain calm about them. Her household was managed by her granddaughter Zainab, who was 18 and who had recently been married to a guild official, and who visited every day, and whose presence was the organization around which Hafsa's life ran. Hafsa herself was mostly confined to the house now. The streets of Istanbul were steep and uneven, and the joints that had served her for 71 years were communicating their fatigue. But she sat at the upper window of her house, the window that looked out over the street and the rooftops to the water, and she watched. She had been watching Istanbul from this window for 40 years, or from a succession of windows in a succession of houses in the same neighborhood, which amounted to the same thing. She had watched the city grow and change, and stay the same in the ways that cities stay the same under the surface change. She had watched sultans come and go, one building something here, one tearing something down there, the constant construction that was the Ottoman administration's way of expressing confidence in the future. She had watched the population grow, which she felt in the density of the street below her window, the press of people that was more than it had been when she was young. She had watched the coffee houses arrive and had, initially objected, and had subsequently accepted, and now occasionally sent Zeynep to fetch her a cup, which she drank in the window and found acceptable. She was not sentimental about the past. The past had been harder in specific ways and easier in other specific ways, and the question of whether it was better was not one she found interesting. The present was here. The city was here. The window was here. That was enough. The neighborhood mosque was the center of the neighborhood's daily life in a way that is difficult to translate into modern terms. Not simply as a place of prayer, though it was that, and the 5 daily prayers that drew the neighborhood's male population to it were the organizing rhythm of the day, but as a social institution, the place where the imam knew who was sick, who had died, who had recently arrived, who was having trouble. The place where the men of the neighborhood gathered after prayer for the kind of conversation that was both social and practical, the exchange of information about the affairs of the community. The place where disputes were sometimes brought before the imam for mediation before they went to the cadi, the judge, which was more expensive and more formal and not always necessary. The imam of Fatma's neighborhood mosque was a man named Hüskin Effendi, middle-aged, careful, well-read in the religious sciences and in the practical matters of his congregation's lives. He was not a theologian. The great theologians were at the medres, the religious schools associated with the mosque complexes of the sultans and viziers. He was a neighborhood cleric, which is a different job, the pastoral work of keeping a specific community spiritually and socially coherent, managing the individual relationships that make a neighborhood a community rather than simply a collection of households. He knew Fatma. He knew Ibrahim. He knew the widow Hafsa, whose opinions on religious matters he respected without always sharing. He knew Murad, the young Chancery scribe, who had been attending the neighborhood mosque since his arrival in Istanbul, and who struck Hüskin Effendi as a serious young man who was in the process of becoming something, though what exactly was not yet visible. The imam's role in Ottoman Istanbul was embedded in the administrative structure of the empire in a specific way. He kept the records of births, deaths, and marriages in his neighborhood. He verified the religious legitimacy of transactions when asked. He was, in a technical sense, a state employee paid from the endowment revenues that funded the mosque and its attached institutions. But his daily function was community function, pastoral function, the function that every organized human community seems to generate for someone, because human communities require tending. By midday the bread was gone. Not the last loaf. Fatma never sold the last loaf, keeping it back for the household. But effectively gone. The morning rush and the steady sales of the late morning had emptied the basket, and she was beginning to think about when to close and return home and what the afternoon held. The afternoon held the household, which in the Ottoman city of this period was the primary domestic space for women of her class. Not confinement. This distinction matters. The women of Istanbul moved through the city. They went to the public bath, the Hammam, which was a segregated female space, and one of the primary social institutions of women's public life in Ottoman cities. They visited each other's houses. They went to the shrines of female saints, which were important places of female religious practice, in a way that the formal mosque was not. The female religious world having developed its own institutions and its own geography in the spaces that the male-dominated formal structures had not claimed. They went to the market. The fabric market in particular was a female-dominated commercial space, where the women who sold lace and embroidery and fine thread worked alongside the male fabric merchants. But the household was the primary territory, and the household of an Ottoman city woman of this class was not merely a domestic space. It was a social space, a productive space, an economic space. The textile work happened there, the embroidery that produced both household goods and items for sale, the food preparation that was the day's organizing labor, the children's education in the early years before the boys went to the mektep, and the girls learned from their mothers and the female networks of the neighborhood. The visiting that was the primary mechanism of female community life, the women of the neighborhood coming and going, sharing news and information, and the kind of mutual support that kept households functioning in a city without the official social services that would take 2 more centuries to develop. Fatma was good at visiting and being visited. She maintained her network of relationships with the same practical thoroughness that she maintained her bread stall, understanding that the network was the resource, and the resource required maintenance. In the afternoon, Murad went to see the Bosphorus. This was his practice, on the days when the Chancery released him at a reasonable hour, to walk down from the palace district to the waterfront and stand for a while with the water in front of him. He was a young man from a landlocked city in Anatolia, and the Bosphorus was still not ordinary to him. The strait was roughly half a mile wide at the narrowest point and several miles wide at others, and the current through it was significant, the Black Sea water pushing constantly south toward the Marmara, and the ships that moved against this current, the great merchant vessels carrying grain from the Black Sea ports, the galleys of the Ottoman fleet, the smaller trading vessels of every origin, moved with a laboring grandeur that you could see from the shore. The water was the color it went in October, a gray-green in the afternoon light, the surface ruffled by the wind from the north, the European shore visible on one side and the Asian shore on the other. Both shores were populated. Üsküdar, the Asian suburb, separated from the European city by the width of the strait, was visible on the Asian shore, its minarets smaller than the great minarets of the Istanbul hills but present, their thin fingers above the rooftops. The ferries moved between the 2 shores continuously, the small wooden boats carrying the daily traffic of a city that was spread across 2 continents and needed to connect them. He stood there until the light began to go. He thought about his family in Anatolia, which he did less now than he had in the first months, not because he missed them less, but because the city had filled in around the missing and made it a different shape. He thought about the letter he needed to write home, which he had been postponing for 3 weeks because he was not sure what to say, which was its own kind of information about where he was in his relationship with the place he had come from. He thought about the file he had copied that afternoon, an order sent to a provincial governor about a grain tax that Murad had found confusing, and which his supervisor had explained with the patient exasperation of a man who has explained this particular aspect of Ottoman tax administration many times before. He watched the Bosphorus. Then he went home to his rented room in the neighborhood near the Bazaar, where his landlady left bread and olives and sometimes cheese, and he ate and lit his lamp and read the Ottoman poetry that was one of his genuine pleasures. And then he fell asleep with the lamp still burning, which was wasteful, and which he never quite managed to stop doing. The Hammam was the city's social institution that most challenged outside understanding. The public bath, the Hammam, in Ottoman Istanbul was not what it became in the later European imagination, not a place of luxury or decadence. It was a necessity. The private houses of most Istanbul residents did not have bathing facilities. The Hammam was where you washed, regularly, as a basic requirement of physical cleanliness and of the religious practice that required ritual purification before prayer. You went to the Hammam, the way people in other eras and places went to the communal laundry or the village well, because it was where the necessary thing happened, and because the necessary thing happened in company. The women's hammam, a separate space, operating at different hours or in a separate building, was one of the most important social spaces in Ottoman women's lives. This is not an exaggeration. In a social world where women's public life was considerably more constrained than men's, the hammam was one of the few places where women of different households came together, without the male presence that organized their lives at home, and talked. Really talked. The kind of conversation that requires time, relative privacy, and the particular relaxation that heat and water produce. Marriages were arranged in the hammam. The mothers who were evaluating potential daughters-in-law came to see the young women, to assess their health and their character in the relatively unguarded environment. News moved through the hammam at a speed that the formal channels could not match. Disputes were sometimes resolved there. Friendships were maintained there that were not possible to maintain elsewhere. Fatma went on Thursday afternoons. She had been going on Thursday afternoons for 20 years, and the women she met there were the women whose lives ran parallel to hers, whose children's ages roughly matched her children's ages, whose husbands were of roughly the same class, whose neighborhood problems were the neighborhood problems she knew. The hammam on Thursday afternoon was as much a part of her week as the bread stall in the morning. She could not have told you which was more necessary. Both, she would have said, both equally. The cadi, the judge, was one of the most important figures in Ottoman urban life, not simply as an arbiter of disputes, though he was that. As the central administrative figure through whom the Ottoman legal system expressed itself at the local level. The official who kept the records, certified the transactions, registered the property transfers, heard the complaints, applied the law that was simultaneously the shariat of Islamic jurisprudence and the canon of the sultan's legislation, navigating the relationship between the two with the practiced skill that a lifetime of legal training produced. The Cadi court in Istanbul operated every day except Friday, in the building near the neighborhood mosque, and the flow of cases was steady and varied. Property disputes between neighbors, commercial disagreements between merchants, inheritance claims from families, the occasional criminal matter. But most of the cases were small, the texture of urban life making its way into the legal record the way sand makes its way into everything. Someone had not paid for the goods delivered. The water from the neighbor's house was flooding into the yard. The apprentice claimed his master had not fulfilled the training agreement. The widow needed her deceased husband's estate registered so she could prove ownership of the house. The Ottoman court records the Sicil have survived in large numbers, and they are, like the ostraca of Deir el-Medina, one of the great repositories of ordinary human life in a pre-modern city. They show us who went to court and why. They show us that women went, brought cases, testified, registered property, appeared in their own names. They show us that the poor went. The small craftsman's complaint was as registrable as the merchant's. They show us that people of different religious communities went, the non-Muslim subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks and Armenians and Jews, had the option to bring their disputes to the Cadi court rather than to their own community courts. And they did, when they thought the result would favor them. The Cadi who served Fatma's neighborhood had been in this position for 7 years. He was a man of 40, trained at the Medres, experienced in the particular cases that an urban neighborhood produced, capable of navigating the tension between the letter of the law and the practical resolution that would allow the neighborhood to continue functioning. He was not corrupt, or not more corrupt than the position permitted, which was a spectrum. He was competent. He was efficient. He was tired sometimes of the weight of other people's problems coming to him in a steady procession, but he had chosen this work, and he did it with the professional commitment that the choice required. Fatma had appeared before him once, 3 years ago, in a dispute with a neighboring stall holder about the boundary of their respective spaces. She had won. Not because she was a better person than her neighbor, she was not certain about this, but because she had the document that proved her case, which she had had the foresight to register with the Cadi's court when she first took the stall. Documentation. In the Ottoman city, documentation was the difference. The Galata Quarter across the Golden Horn on the northern shore was a different Istanbul. The bridge over the Golden Horn, the Galata Bridge in some form, had connected the European shore to the Galata district for centuries, and Galata was the quarter where the non-Muslim commercial communities were most concentrated. The Genoese, who had been there since the Byzantine period and who had built the Galata Tower, which still rose above the quarter's rooftops. The Greeks of the Fanner district. The Jewish community that had grown substantially after 1492, when the Ottoman Empire had welcomed the Jews expelled from Spain. Sultan Bayezid II had reportedly remarked that anyone who called Ferdinand of Spain wise had not been paying attention, since Fernando had impoverished Spain by expelling its most productive commercial citizens and enriched the Ottoman Empire by giving them to him. This was the kind of thing Ottoman sultans said, and it was also, from the Ottoman commercial perspective, true. The Sephardic Jews who came to Istanbul after 1492 brought with them the commercial networks, the languages, the financial sophistication, and the printing technology that had made Jewish life in Iberia so productive, and they deployed these in the Ottoman city with the energy of people who had learned not to take the security of belonging for granted. Murad had been to Galata once, with a colleague from the Chancery who had business there. He had found it disorienting in a way that Istanbul proper did not disorient him, a neighborhood that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, where the muezzin called from a mosque, but the church bells also rang, where the Turkish commercial language mixed with Greek and Ladino and Italian, where the wine shops were open in ways they were not in the Muslim quarters of the city. He had not stayed long. He had found what he needed to know about it, that it was there, that it was part of the city, that the city was larger than he had thought and kept being larger than he thought. This was Istanbul's particular quality. It was always more than you thought. It was always discovering more of itself to you. The textile trade of Istanbul was enormous. Not merely in the sense that clothing required cloth, though that was true for 700,000 people. The Ottoman textile trade was one of the empire's most important industries, a commercial network that connected the silk-producing regions of Persia and Bursa, the wool-producing regions of Anatolia, the cotton-growing regions of Egypt and Syria, the weaving workshops of Istanbul and Bursa, and the other great Ottoman textile cities, and the international markets of Europe that were, by the middle of the 16th century, consuming Ottoman silk and textiles in significant quantities. The fabric market in Istanbul was one of the city's great commercial spaces, an indoor-outdoor complex of stalls and workshops and storage spaces where the entire range of Ottoman textile production was available, from the coarsest wool to the finest Iznik silk, from the simple striped cloth of everyday clothing to the elaborate brocades worn by the palace officials on state occasions. The price range was equally broad. You could buy cloth in the fabric market that cost a week's wages for a yard, or cloth that cost an hour's wages. Fatma bought her household cloth here. She was a knowledgeable buyer. She had been doing this for 20 years and she knew what she was looking at when the merchant held the cloth to the light. The quality of the weave, the evenness of the thread, the accuracy of the color. A misrepresented color could be grounds for returning the cloth and reclaiming the price. A right she knew she had because she had exercised it once, years ago, with a merchant who had tried to pass off a faded red as a good red, and she had taken the cloth to the caddy and gotten her money back. The cloth she bought was the cloth of a household of modest means but not deprivation, the medium-weight cotton for everyday clothing, the slightly finer fabric for the garments worn on festival days, the wool for the winter coverings that Istanbul's October was already beginning to suggest you should be thinking about. Ibrahim needed a new work robe. She had been looking at the fabric. She thought she knew what she was going to buy. She had not told him yet, because if she told him he would have opinions about it, and his opinions about fabric were not particularly informed opinions. She would buy what was right and he would be grateful. This too was their marriage. The streets of Istanbul were not organized in the grid fashion that later city planning would bring to urban development. They had grown organically, over the centuries, following the contours of the hills, the placement of the buildings, the paths of least resistance that people took when moving between places, and that, over enough time and enough people, became streets. The result was a city that was beautiful and entirely inefficient in terms of navigation, a labyrinth of narrow streets and sudden dead ends and small squares and unexpected views that opened suddenly between the buildings. The main commercial streets were wider and more deliberate. The great commercial axes that connected the major bazaars and ports had been maintained and improved by the Ottoman administration. But the residential streets of the neighborhoods were narrow enough that two donkeys with loads could barely pass each other, and the wooden houses of the city overhung the streets at the upper floors, their projecting bays reaching toward each other across the street and sometimes, on the narrowest streets, nearly touching. The fire risk was constant. The wooden city burned. This was not a metaphor. Istanbul burned regularly throughout its history, the great fires that swept through the wooden residential neighborhoods with a speed that the Ottoman firefighting organizations, however well organized, could not always match. The fire watch, the Çolumbasay, the pump operators, were a civic institution. The neighborhoods organized water supplies in sand buckets. The mosques, being stone, served as fire refuges. Hafsa had seen 3 major fires in her lifetime. One had taken the house in which she had lived as a young wife. She had rebuilt, as people do, because the alternative was not rebuilding, and the neighborhood had helped in the way that neighborhoods help when the disaster is specific and the community is intact. She did not dwell on the fires. They were part of the city's life, the way floods were part of the life of cities on rivers. You built in wood because wood was available and cheap and fast. You accepted the fire risk because you accepted the conditions of your place. She had rebuilt. The new house was still standing. She was in it. The muezzin who called from the minaret of the neighborhood mosque was a young man named Osman. He was 26, with a voice that had been trained since childhood by the imam of his village in Thrace, a village that had recognized his voice as something specific and had arranged, through the usual channels of Ottoman religious education, for its development. He had been muezzin in Istanbul for 2 years. He was good at his work. The first Fajr call was the hardest, up before the light, the cold minaret stairs, the exposed platform in the Istanbul wind, the projection of the voice across the sleeping city. But he was good at it. The voice that Fatma heard each morning without waking, the voice that her body recognized as the mechanism of sleep's last minutes, that was Osman's voice, trained in Thrace, refined in Istanbul, sent across the rooftops of the Eminönü quarter in the dark before dawn. He came down from the minaret after the Fajr and went to the small room in the mosque's annex where he slept between the calls. He went back up for the sunrise prayer, Ishraq, not one of the 5 obligatory prayers but a sunnah prayer, the recommended additional devotion. Then down again. Then up for Zuhr at midday. The rhythm of his day was the rhythm of the calls, the movement between the room and the minaret 5 times a day, the voice 5 times a day projected outward into the city that went on receiving it and shaping its days around it. He liked the city. He had been afraid of it when he arrived, the size, the noise, the density. But he had found his corner of it. The mosque, the neighborhood, the men who came to pray and who knew his voice and who sometimes stopped to say a kind word about it. The city had become his size, in the way that cities eventually become your size if you stay long enough to let them. He did not know how long he would stay. He was 26. There was time to find out. The soup kitchen, the Emaret, was one of the most important charitable institutions of Ottoman Istanbul. The great mosque complexes, Süleymaniye, Fatih, the mosque foundations of the major viziers, each had an attached Emaret, a kitchen that produced food twice a day for the poor, the students, the travelers, the religious scholars who were entitled to eat there. The scale of these operations was considerable. The Süleymaniye Emaret, when it was complete, would feed hundreds of people each day, the food produced in industrial quantities in the great kitchen that was part of the complex's design. The recipes were recorded. The accounts were kept. We know what was served. A basic soup, bread, sometimes a rice dish, the pilav that was the Ottoman staple, occasionally meat on feast days. The emirate was part of the economic system of the city in a way that went beyond charity. It was the unemployment insurance before unemployment insurance, the mechanism that kept people who had no income from dying in the street, the institutional expression of the Islamic obligation of zakat, giving, organized at the scale of a great empire. The sultans competed, in a sense, in the size and generosity of their emirate foundations. The emirate was the monument that measured not military power, but the ability to sustain the weak, which was also power, of a different kind. Murad ate at the fatty emirate on the days when the Chancery's late hours had left him without time to organize his own food. He ate the soup and the bread with the students from the medres and the traveling scholars and the poor men of the neighborhood, all eating together in the long hall, the class distinctions that organized the rest of the city suspended for the duration of a meal. He thought about this on those evenings. The emirate was one of the things about Istanbul that he found genuinely moving, the organized mercy of it, the scale at which the city decided that no one should go hungry. He went home. He wrote the letter home that he had been postponing. He told his mother that Istanbul was large but becoming known. He told her that the Chancery was interesting in ways he had not expected. He told her he had eaten well. He did not tell her he had eaten at the emirate because she would worry, and she didn't need to worry. The evening prayer came with the dusk. The Maghrib, the prayer at sunset, was the signal that the commercial day was ending. The bazaar stalls began to close. The fabric merchants folded their lengths of cloth and locked their display cases. The spice sellers put away the great jars. The bread sellers who had anything left sold it at the end-of-day discount that was the market's way of clearing perishable inventory. Fatma did not usually have anything left. She was generally sold out well before Maghrib. She walked home through the streets that were beginning to empty of commercial activity and fill with the domestic traffic of the evening. The water carriers making their last circuits, the wood sellers finishing their deliveries, the coffee house keepers bringing in their chairs from the street. She walked the route she had walked every evening for 12 years, through the streets that she knew the way you know streets you have walked every day for 12 years, not consciously, but with the body's automatic navigation, the feet finding the way while the mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Ibrahim, about the new work robe she had been planning, about the conversation she needed to have with her daughter, who was 15 and entering the phase of life where the conversations become more complicated, about the price of grain, which had been going up, and whether the bread price she was charging was going to need adjustment, and whether adjusting it would cost her customers who were managing on very tight margins. About Hafsa, who she was going to visit tomorrow afternoon, because Hafsa's granddaughter had mentioned that Hafsa was having a harder week than usual with the joints, and you went to see the people who were having hard weeks. She reached her street. She reached her door. She went inside. Ibrahim was home, the day's baking done, his hands scrubbed but still faintly floury in the creases. The smell of the house was warm bread and wood smoke, and the dinner that she was about to start cooking. And the smell was, in the specific way of smells associated with home, both particular and universal. The smell of a specific house in a specific city in a specific century, which was also, beneath all of that specificity, simply the smell of home. She started cooking. The city at night was a different city. Not quieter exactly. Istanbul's waterfront never entirely quieted. The night traffic of the shipping lanes and the fishing boats continuing through the dark hours. Not darker than you'd expect. The city had public lanterns in some of its main streets, and the mosques were lit for the night prayers. But different in the way that cities are always different at night. The public world withdrawing, the private world becoming more present, the streets emptying of commerce and filling with something else. The watchman, the Beksi, walked the streets at night. He was a civic institution, the Ottoman version of the night watch, armed with a long staff and the authority to question anyone moving through the streets after the evening prayer without apparent purpose. The Beksi were not simply security. They were also fire watch, alert to the smell of smoke or the glow of flame that meant another wooden neighborhood was about to catch. Their rounds were regular. Their presence was the city's institutional acknowledgement that the night required its own particular form of care. The Ibrahim who went asleep beside Fatma that night was tired in the specific way of a man who had been working with his body since before dawn, the bone-deep tiredness that settled into the muscles and the joints and which was, in its way, a kind of satisfaction. He had baked good bread. He had done the work. The tiredness was the evidence. Fatma lay beside him and listened to the city's night sounds and thought about tomorrow, the bread, the stall, the customers, the daughter, Hafsa. She was not anxious. She was planning. Planning was her natural mode, the way that some people's resting state is worry and other people's resting state is arrangement. She arranged. She made the plan for tomorrow and set it in her mind and let it sit there complete. Outside, the Bosphorus moved. The night fishing boats were out on the strait. The stars were clear. October nights in Istanbul were often clear, the summer humidity gone, the air from the north dry and sharp. The watchman passed the street below, his staff tapping on the stones. One tap, two taps, then gone, the city breathing, the city in its particular way at rest. The great mosques of Istanbul were not simply houses of prayer. They were the organizing centers of entire urban complexes. The Kuliye, the mosque complex that included the mosque itself, the medres, the emirate, the hospital, the caravanserai, the hammam, the market stalls whose rents funded the whole operation. This was the Ottoman model of urban charity, not the individual philanthropist but the institutionalized endowment, the vakif, the pious foundation that tied a specific body of income-producing property to a specific set of public services in perpetuity. The vakif system was one of the Ottoman Empire's most significant contributions to urban management. It created institutions that outlasted their founders, that continued to function regardless of who was sultan, that provided services to people who had no connection to the founder and no obligation to them, simply because the founder had wanted to build something that would last. Sinan's Süleymaniye complex, when it was complete, would be funded by its own vakif, shops and commercial properties donated by Suleiman for the specific purpose of paying for the complex's operations in perpetuity. The hospital that was part of the complex would treat the poor. The emirate would feed them. The medres would educate the scholars who would in turn serve the empire. The whole thing self-sustaining, the income covering the expenses, the institution going on after the sultan who built it was dead and buried. This is why so many Ottoman buildings have survived, not merely because they were well constructed, though Sinan's structural engineering is extraordinary, but because they were endowed with the income to maintain themselves. The building that has someone paid to maintain it lasts longer than the building that doesn't. This is not architecture. This is accounting. The Ottomans understood it as both. The spice bazaar, the Masur Sarshasi, was not only about spices. The name means the Egyptian bazaar, because it was originally built and endowed by revenues from Egypt, and because the spices and goods from the Eastern trade, which came through Egypt, were its primary inventory. But the bazaar had expanded over time to include the full range of goods that the Eastern and Southern trade networks brought to Istanbul. The dried fruits from Persia and Arabia, the coffee from Yemen, the herbs and minerals of the pharmacological trade, the oils and resins and unguents that were simultaneously cooking ingredients, medicinal preparations, and cosmetic materials. The smell of the spice bazaar in the morning was one of the great sensory experiences of Istanbul, the accumulated fragrance of hundreds of varieties of dried plant material, of bark and seed and resin and flower, the whole complex of the world's aromatics compressed into a covered market space, where the stone walls and the arched ceiling held the smell the way A jar holds its contents. You walked in from the street and the smell changed. Everything changed. The rest of the city, the waterfront, the fish, the wood smoke, the people receded, and you were in a space defined by what it sold. Fatma passed through it or around it every day. She knew it too well to smell it as a newcomer smelled it. She had had it as background all her working life, and her sensory relationship with it was now of the calibrated, practical kind. She knew which stall had the best quality cumin. She knew which spice merchant would hold her good prices, and which one was watching for an opportunity. She knew the smell of fresh versus old stock in a way that required no conscious analysis. She had been here long enough for the bazaar to be hers. The Ottoman writing system was a specific craft. The Arabic script adapted for Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, was written in the distinctive calligraphic styles that had been developed in the great calligraphic tradition of Islamic civilization. Murad had learned the divan calligraphy required by the Chancery, the specific style that the official documents demanded, with its distinctive proportions and its specific rules about the relative size of letters, the thickness of strokes, the angle of the pen. The pen was a reed pen, the kalam, cut at a specific angle with a small knife, the cutting of the kalam itself a skill that was part of the scribal training. When Murad wrote, he was not simply recording information. He was performing a craft that had a 300-year tradition behind it in the Ottoman context, and a 1,000-year tradition behind it in the broader Islamic world. The well-written official document was a beautiful object as well as a functional one. The calligrapher's skill was a marker of professional competence in a way that the content of the document was not. You could write the most important order in the empire, but if the script was careless, you had failed at something fundamental. He was, by his supervisor's assessment, competent, not yet excellent, competent. There was a standard toward which he was working, and he could see the standard, and he was not there yet, and the distance was shrinking. The Chancery's chief scribe, a man of 50 named Selim Celebi, who had been in this position for 15 years and who had opinions about calligraphy that he expressed with the mild ferocity of someone for whom the craft was a religious matter, had told Murad twice that his lower loop formation was inconsistent. The third time, Murad thought, would be the last time he needed to be told. He practiced the loop formation in the evenings on scrap paper, getting the consistency right, the lamp burning, the reed pen moving, the practice that was also the patience. The fish of the Bosphorus were famous throughout the Ottoman world. The autumn bluefish run, the loofer, was an event. Not simply an event for fishermen, though it was that. An event for the city. When the bluefish came through the strait in October, the Istanbul waterfront changed. The boats went out in numbers. The catches came back in quantities. The fish sellers at the waterfront set up their displays and the prices dropped because the supply was suddenly enormous and the whole city ate bluefish. Grilled, fried in stews, in the stuffed preparation that would become one of Istanbul's most famous street foods. Every household was eating loofer. The smell of grilling fish was everywhere. The fish of the Bosphorus were extraordinary partly because of the biology of the strait. The current that ran south brought cold, oxygenated Black Sea water with a high concentration of the small organisms that the fish ate, and the fish that followed those organisms were large and fat and in excellent condition. The Istanbul fisherman who knew the Bosphorus knew it the way a farmer knows his land, the particular spots where the fish were in particular seasons, the currents that drove the schools, the depth of the water at different points, the signs on the surface that told you what was happening below. Ibrahim bought fish from the same seller at the waterfront for 12 years. Not out of loyalty, though loyalty was part of it. Out of the specific economic relationship that developed between a regular buyer and a reliable seller when both of them understood that the consistency was worth something. The fisherman set aside the best of the catch for Ibrahim. Ibrahim paid on time. The fish were good. Everyone benefited. This was the microeconomy of the Ottoman waterfront, repeated in thousands of such arrangements, the city running on the specific personal relationships that preceded the abstract market mechanism and continued to operate alongside it. Hafsa had a memory for the city that went back 50 years. She remembered the Istanbul of her childhood, in the last years of the 15th century, a city that was already large but that had not yet reached the scale of the Süleymaniye period. She remembered the expansion under Selim I, the decades after Egypt and Syria had been added to the empire, and the goods of the Eastern trade had begun flowing into Istanbul in quantities that changed the city's material texture. She remembered when coffee arrived. She remembered when the first printing presses appeared, not in the Muslim quarters initially, but in the Jewish and Armenian communities, and the Ottoman administration's complicated relationship with this technology that was clearly powerful and clearly in need of management. Her memory was not nostalgic, particularly. The past had been harder in ways that her current comfort made easy to forget, and she was careful not to forget. The famine she had lived through. The plague years, the Great Plague that had moved through Istanbul earlier in the century and killed a significant portion of the city's population. The dead carried out of the neighborhoods in numbers that still marked the memory of anyone old enough to have seen it. The political instabilities of the transition between sultans, the periods when the city was unsure of the succession, and fear moved through the streets like a weather system. Istanbul in the reign of Suleiman was a better city to live in than Istanbul in some of the years she had known. Suleiman was a capable administrator, and the empire was at a peak that subsequent generations would call the High Ottoman period. She knew this. She also knew, because she was 71 and had watched enough cycles, that peaks were followed by other things. She did not discuss this with Zeynep, who was 18 and had enough immediate things to think about. She discussed it with herself, sitting at the window watching the street. The city went on. That was what cities did. They went on. The coffee house that Ibrahim went to after the morning baking was a small establishment 2 streets from the bakery. It had been there for 3 years, long enough to have become established, to have its regulars, to have the particular social texture that a place acquires when the same people have been coming to it long enough to know each other's faces. The owner, a man from Yemen named Abdullah, who had come to Istanbul with a commercial caravan and stayed, made coffee with the method he had learned in the coffee country where he grew up. The fine grind, the brass pot, the specific ratio of coffee to water, the slow heating that brought the coffee to the edge of boiling and back 3 times before it was ready. The taste was bitter and dark and slightly sweet from the amount of sugar that Ibrahim added. He had opinions about the sugar question. He thought the amount of sugar he used was appropriate. Other regular customers had other opinions. This debate about the correct amount of sugar in coffee was one of the recurrent conversations in the coffee house, which is to say, it was never resolved and was always resumed, which is the correct relationship to have with a question about personal taste. The conversations at the coffee house were about everything, about the construction of the Süleymaniye, which everyone in the city had opinions about the price of bread and whether the grain supply was going to hold through the winter, about the recent court case in which a guild member had been found to be selling adulterated goods, a big story in the commercial community, because the guild system's entire legitimacy rested on its quality guarantees. About Suleiman's recent military campaign, its outcome, the peace terms, the assessment of the empire's current position. About the coffee, always about the coffee. Ibrahim listened more than he talked. He was a baker, not a scribe, and he knew things about bread and ovens and the grain market and the quality of the flour from different suppliers. He did not know things about politics and campaigns and court intrigues. He contributed what he knew. He took away what others knew. The exchange was even. The Jewish community of Istanbul in 1540 had been there, in its current form, for about 50 years. The Sephardic Jews who came from Spain after 1492 had organized themselves in the Istanbul neighborhoods with the efficiency of a community that had done this before, that had lived under Christian rule, and then under Muslim rule, and that understood, from long experience, the specific requirements of living as a tolerated minority in someone else's city. They had their own courts, their own charitable institutions, their own educational system, their own languages, Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish that would be spoken by Sephardic communities for another 400 years. And they had their commercial networks, which were the reason Sultan Bayezid had welcomed them. The networks that connected Istanbul to Venice, to Antwerp, to the other Sephardic communities that had scattered across the Mediterranean basin, and that made the community enormously valuable to the empire's commercial system. The relationship between the Ottoman state and its Jewish and Christian subjects was governed by the millet system, the arrangement by which non-Muslim communities administered their own internal affairs, maintained their own religious institutions, operated their own courts for personal and family law, while remaining subject to the Ottoman state for criminal law, commercial regulation, and taxation. It was not equality. The non-Muslim dhimmi communities paid a special tax, the jizya, that marked their different status. They could not build new places of worship above a certain scale. Their testimony carried less weight in the Qadi courts than a Muslim's. It was also not persecution, or not usually, and this made it in the context of 16th century Europe, where Jews were being expelled from one country after another and slaughtered in periodic waves of violence, something approaching safety. The relative security of Ottoman Jewish and Christian life was real, and the communities that benefited from it knew it was real. The money changer that Murad sometimes needed to use in the Grand Bazaar was a Jewish man named Yitzhak, who had come to Istanbul from Thessaloniki, the great Sephardic city of the northern Balkans, 10 years ago. He had a wife and 3 children and a house near the Balat neighborhood, and a business that required him to understand the exchange rates between Ottoman aspers, Venetian ducats, Spanish reals, and half a dozen other currencies at any given moment, which required the kind of mathematical attention that Murad found impressive. Yitzhak spoke Turkish and Ladino and some Greek and a little Italian. Murad spoke Turkish and some Arabic. They communicated efficiently in Turkish with occasional detours into gesture. The exchange rate was always fair. The transaction was always exact. Murad trusted him in the specific way that you trust people whose livelihood depends on not cheating you. The dough. Ibrahim appeared in the kitchen at the moment that the dough was ready, as if he had been monitoring it through the wall, which in a sense he had some combination of the smell and the passage of time, and the body's internalized schedule that no clock could replicate. He worked the dough with the efficiency of long practice, the shaping of each loaf taking seconds, the practiced hands knowing the right tension and the right weight without measurement. He loaded the oven with the sequence that maximized the use of the heat. He waited. This was the part of baking that was not skilled in the active sense, the oven doing its work, the baker standing or sitting nearby with the patience of someone who has learned that intervening in this stage does not help. Ibrahim drank his morning tea. He checked the fire. He listened to the particular sound the loaves made as they baked, a very faint cracking sound as the crust set, the sound that told him things were going as expected. He had been baking since he was 12. He was 38. 26 years of knowing bread in the specific way that you know something you have done every day for 26 years. Not as knowledge, but as sense, the body understanding before the mind catches up. The bread was part of him in the way that the flood was part of merit, the way the tomb walls were part of Ka. The thing you have given your days to becomes, eventually, the thing you are. He did not think about this. He checked the loaves. He adjusted the fire. The bread baked. The October morning came full. By the time Fatma had her stall set up and the first customers were beginning to appear, the sun was over the Asian shore, and the Bosphorus had gone from black to gray to the particular pewter green of an October morning, and the city was in its full morning activity. The loading of the ships at the waterfront, the opening of the bazaar stalls, the water carriers beginning their circuits. The smell of food from the neighborhood cookshops that served the thousands of people in the commercial districts who ate their main meals outside the home. The cookshop, the ashhane, was an institution of Ottoman urban life as important as the coffee house. The bakery workers, the market workers, the porters, the apprentices, all the people who did not have a household kitchen or did not have the time to use it ate at the cookshops that were distributed through every commercial district. The food was simple: a meat stew, a rice dish, the legume preparations that were the protein of the working diet. The price was calibrated to the income of the working population, which is to say, low enough that people could afford it, high enough that the cookshop could continue to exist. The city fed itself. Not elegantly, not always well, but continuously, the enormous machine of supply and preparation and distribution running every day, the grain coming in from the Black Sea ports and from Egypt and Anatolia, the bread baking in the hundreds of bakeries, the cookshops cooking, the fish sellers selling, the emirate feeding those who could not afford even the cookshop. No one in Istanbul in 1540 went hungry because there was no food in the city. The city had food. The city had the infrastructure to distribute it. The city had the institutions to provide it, at least minimally, to those who could not afford it. This was the Ottoman imperial capital at its best, the managed abundance of a system that knew it needed to feed its population and had organized itself to do so. There were individual hardships, there was poverty, and there was the anxiety of poverty, but the city's systems held. The children of Istanbul were the city's future in the way that children have always been the future. But in Ottoman Istanbul, the future was also very specifically organized. The mektep, the primary school attached to the mosque, was where boys of the Muslim community began their formal education. The Quran, reading, writing, the basic arithmetic. The medres was the higher education, the great schools attached to the major mosque complexes, where the religious sciences and the other disciplines were taught. And then there was the devshirme system, the levy of Christian boys from the Balkan provinces who were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, trained in the palace schools, and who became the most powerful officials and military commanders of the empire. The Grand Vizier who managed the empire's administration on Suleiman's behalf was a man named Ibrahim Pasha, not to be confused with Fatma's husband, who had come to Istanbul through this system as a child from Greece, and who had risen, through the palace schools and his own extraordinary ability, to be the most powerful official in the most powerful empire in the world. He had been Suleiman's closest friend and his most trusted minister for more than 15 years. He had also recently been executed, on Suleiman's order. This was the other side of the Ottoman system's extraordinary social mobility. The man of talent who rose from nothing to the top had arrived at the top by the Sultan's favor and could be removed from it by the Sultan's will. The Grand Vizier who managed the empire could be strangled in the night by the Sultan's palace officials, his property confiscated, his career ended in an hour. This was not arbitrary tyranny exactly. The Ottoman system had its own logic. The man who accumulated too much power independent of the sultan's will had become a liability. The removal was the system correcting itself. Murad knew about Ibrahim Pasha's execution. Everyone in Istanbul knew. He thought about it sometimes in the evenings at the Bosphorus. About the specific form of vulnerability that came from being entirely dependent on a single powerful person's favor. About whether the life of the Chancery scribe, which was not glamorous and not powerful, was in some ways the safer life. He thought about this without reaching a conclusion. He was 23. He had time to think about it more. The Hammam on Thursday afternoon was everything it was supposed to be. Fatma went with her neighbor Aish, who was 3 years younger and who was the closest thing to a best friend that 43-year-old women running households and businesses in the same neighborhood developed. Not the friendship of girlhood, which was different, but the friendship of parallel lives conducted in the same space over enough years that the parallel lines had become braided. They walked through the neighborhood streets to the women's entrance of the neighborhood hammam, paid the attendant, and entered the dressing room where the street clothes were left and the wrapping cloths were taken, and the warm air of the hammam first hit the face. The warm air was the beginning of the transformation. It was the signal. You are leaving the street, you are leaving the commercial world, you are leaving the managing and the planning. For the next 2 hours you are here. The warm room was first, the tepidarium of the Ottoman Hammam, the intermediate temperature space where you acclimated to the heat before moving to the hot room. Then the hot room, the hararet, the central domed space with its marble platform, the Gerbek tashi, warmed from below, where you lay and sweated and were washed and kneaded by the attendant who combined the functions of masseur and scrubber in the specific Hammam tradition. Keys, the scrubbing cloth, removed the layers of the week in a process that was vigorous to the point of discomfort, and which left you feeling scraped clean in a way that no other form of washing produced. Fatma and Aish talked through all of it. The news of the neighborhood. The daughter question, Aish's eldest, was recently married, and the marriage was going as marriages go in the first year, which is to say, with effort, with adjustment, with the specific challenges of two people learning to be one household. Fatma listened. She offered what she thought was useful. She knew when to be quiet. They talked about Hafsa, whom they both visited, whose declining mobility was a subject of shared concern. They talked about the grain price, which affected both their households. They talked about a woman in the next street whose husband had been absent for 6 months, the rumor and the reality of it, the community's responsibility toward the household left behind. By the time they came back out into the cool October air, 2 hours had passed, and the city seemed somehow more manageable than it had before they went in. This was the Hammam's function, not the cleaning, which was also real, the reset. The 2 hours of being somewhere warm and human, and unhurried in a world that was otherwise always cold and rushed and managed. Zainab came to see Hafsa at the end of the afternoon. She came every day, reliably, at the time between the afternoon prayer and the evening prayer when the day was winding down, and Hafsa was most likely to be awake and alert. She brought food, always something prepared in her own kitchen, because Hafsa's appetite had become selective, and the familiar flavors of food prepared by someone she trusted were more reliable than anything else. Hafsa was at the window when she arrived. She was always at the window. Zainab unpacked the food, a dish of rice with vegetables, a small piece of lamb, some bread, and sat with her grandmother while she ate. They talked about the day. Hafsa asked about Zainab's husband, whose name was Maimed, and whose competence Hafsa assessed weekly with the rigor she brought to everything. She approved of Maimed mostly. He was not brilliant. He was steady, which Hafsa considered more valuable than brilliant. Brilliant was exciting. Steady was what you needed for the long work of a life. She told Zainab this. Zainab had heard it before. She nodded in the way of someone who has heard something before but who is also on some level still receiving it. After the food, Hafsa asked for tea. Zainab made it. They sat together in the diminishing afternoon light, the window showing the street below in its evening mode, the city doing what the city did. "How is the bread seller?" Hafsa asked. "Fatma Hanum is well," said Zainab. "She sold out again today." Hafsa nodded. She approved of Fatma. The woman had made something that worked and kept it working. That was the achievement, not the grand gesture. The consistent, day-after-day competence that kept a household and a business and a neighborhood relationship in functioning order. She looked out the window. The light was going. The city was settling. 71 years in this city. Most of the people she had known were gone. The city was still here. She was still here, more or less. Tomorrow she would be at this window. The city would go on below her. The bread would be sold. The Bosphorus would move. She was not afraid of any of this. She was, in the specific way of very old people who have managed to get old without being broken by it, at ease. The stars over Istanbul were the same stars that the Byzantine astronomers had observed from this same hill. Not quite the same, the stars shift over centuries. The procession of the equinoxes moving the celestial pole slowly through its long cycle, and the constellations that rise over the Bosphorus in the 16th century are oriented slightly differently than they were in the 6th. But the same stars, the same points of light, named in Arabic by the Islamic astronomers who had built on the Greek tradition and extended it, whose work the Ottoman scholars had received and continued. The Ottoman intellectual tradition was not separate from the Islamic tradition that preceded it. The great works of Islamic mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were the foundation. The Ottoman scholars at the madrases, in the palace schools, in the libraries that the sultans maintained, read Avicenna and Al-Kindi and Ibn Rushd, studied the astronomical tables of al-Battani, worked with the mathematical traditions that the Islamic world had developed partly from Greek sources and partly from its own original contributions. Murad had been educated in this tradition. Not as a scholar, he was a Chancery scribe, not an alim, but as someone who had received the standard education of a literate Ottoman and who therefore knew the basics of what the educated person of his time knew. He knew the Quran by heart. He knew the basic principles of Islamic jurisprudence. He knew some classical poetry, both Arabic and Persian, the prestige literary languages of the Ottoman intellectual world, as well as the Ottoman Turkish poetry that was developing its own tradition. He knew that the stars he was looking at over the Bosphorus had been mapped and named by people who had spent their lives looking at them. He found this thought comforting, in the way that evidence of sustained human attention to the world is comforting. The world has been looked at, carefully, by people who cared about what they saw. The silk trade was one of the Ottoman Empire's economic foundations. The city of Bursa, 3 hours by boat across the Sea of Marmara from Istanbul, was the great silk market of the Ottoman Empire, the place where the raw silk from Persia and the Caspian region arrived, and was woven into the luxury fabrics that were one of the Ottoman Empire's most important export commodities. The great silk workshops of Bursa produced the fabrics that were worn in the Ottoman palace and that were exported to the courts of Europe, the kaftans and the velvets, and the heavy brocades that appear in European portraits of the 16th century on the backs of kings and their consorts. The silk trade went through Istanbul. The merchants who moved the silk from Bursa to the European markets, Venice, Genoa, and increasingly the Flemish cities, were among the city's most important commercial figures. The trade route was not simple. The silk moved by boat across the Marmara, entered Istanbul through the harbor, was taxed and registered, and then moved on westward by sea or overland through the Balkans. The Ottoman state took its percentage at every step, and the percentage was significant, and the significance funded the Süleymaniye. Fatma wore silk once a year at the Eid feast. She owned one silk garment, a headscarf of deep crimson, bought years ago from a merchant who was selling off a small quantity of second-quality fabric at a price that a bread seller could afford if she saved for 2 months. The scarf was worn once a year. It was handled with the care given to things that represent a significant fraction of a year's savings. It was kept in a specific place in a specific box. It was beautiful. She knew it was beautiful. She wore it on the feast day and put it away and thought about it the rest of the year in the specific way of people who have one beautiful thing that they take out at appropriate intervals. This was the silk trade from the other end. The sounds of the city. Istanbul in 1540 was one of the loudest cities on earth, in the way that dense cities without the noise management of modern engineering are loud, the accumulated sound of 700,000 people's daily activities, the ships on the Bosphorus, the market vendors, the hammering from the workshops, the animals, the construction, the prayers. And underneath all of it, or rather woven through all of it, the particular acoustic signature of a city built on hills and surrounded by water. Sound in Istanbul behaved differently than sound in inland cities. The water reflected it. The hills channeled it. The narrow streets of the residential neighborhoods trapped it and concentrated it so that the sound from one end of a street arrived at the other end with a clarity that surprised newcomers. The muezzin's call carried over all of it. 5 times a day, the calls from dozens of minarets sounding in the complicated harmony of voices starting at slightly different times, the echo and the overlap creating the particular sound texture of the Ottoman city at prayer, not unison but something denser, the sound of a city observing a shared practice at the same moment, but in its own way and in its own time. Murad heard it differently now than he had in the first weeks. In the first weeks it had been a sound to which he paid conscious attention. Now it was the city's breathing, the rhythm of the place, the thing that told you where you were in the day, and that marked the hours with more reliability than any clock. He was becoming the city. He could feel himself becoming the city. This was, he thought, what it meant to belong to a place, not to choose it but to find yourself changed by it, shaped by its rhythms, your own rhythms reorganizing themselves around it. He was not there yet, but he was on the way. The cats of Istanbul were a civilization within a civilization. They have always been part of the city. The cats of Istanbul, in every century the city has existed, have been visible in every account, present in every neighborhood, treated with a particular mixture of affection and respect that is specific to Istanbul, and that persists to the present day. The Islamic tradition's general positive regard for cats. The Prophet is reported to have been fond of cats, and there are hadith about the proper treatment of them, was amplified in Istanbul by the practical reality that a city of this density and this amount of stored food required feline management of the rodent population. The cats were not owned. This is the key point about Istanbul's cats. They belong to the streets, the mosques, the markets, the neighborhoods. They were fed by everyone and owned by no one. They were a communal resource, a shared responsibility, a part of the city's life that was simply there, managed by custom rather than by any official arrangement. The mosque cats, the cats that lived in the great mosques, fed by the imam and the attendants, sleeping on the prayer rugs in the manner of cats who have understood that they are welcome, were a particular institution. The market cats who patrolled the spaces between the stalls and were fed by the merchants whose goods they protected were another. Fatma fed the cat that worked her end of the street. She had been feeding it for 4 years. She did not think of it as her cat. She thought of it as the street's cat. The distinction mattered to her, though she would have had difficulty explaining exactly why. The cat, for its part, came to her stall every morning before the bread was set out, received its food with the absence of gratitude that is the cat's characteristic mode, and then went about its day in the market area. They had an understanding. The understanding did not require a name for the cat. The cat did not require a name. The education of the Ottoman state's most capable servants happened at the Enderun. The Enderun was the palace school, the inner service of the Ottoman court, where the boys brought through the Devshirme system and the most talented sons of the Muslim population were educated together in the palace's inner courts. They learned languages, Turkish, Arabic, Persian. They learned the Islamic sciences. They learned music, which the Ottoman court valued highly. They learned horsemanship and the military arts. They learned the administrative sciences that the empire required, and they competed in the specific intense competition that a merit-based institution within a court system creates for the positions that would give them access to power. The grand viziers, the admirals, the governors of great provinces, a significant proportion of them had passed through the Enderun. Men of no family, with nothing behind them but the ability that the school had identified and trained, in positions of more authority than the princes of most European kingdoms. This was the Ottoman meritocracy, incomplete and distorted by the realities of court politics, but genuinely meritocratic in its foundational logic. Murad had not gone through the Enderun. He was not a Devshirme boy. He was a provincial official's son who had been sent to the Chancery through the ordinary channels of Ottoman appointment. The Chancery was not the palace. The scribe was not the grand vizier. But he had seen the Enderun graduates, the palace officials who came to the Chancery with orders from above and who carried themselves with the specific confidence of people who had been trained since childhood in the exercise of authority. He was not envious, exactly. He recognized the difference. His path was different. His path was also a path. He was on it. The last light of the October day fell across the Bosphorus in a way that had been falling across the Bosphorus since before the city was there. The light came from the west, from over the European hills, and it hit the water of the strait at a low angle and went golden on the surface, and the ships moving through it became silhouettes against the gold, and the Asian shore on the other side went deep amber, and the minarets of Üsküdar became dark needles against the warm sky. This light happened every October evening. It had been happening since the first people stood on the hill above this strait and understood that there was something extraordinary about this place, this specific confluence of water and land and light that made it different from every other place on earth. It had been happening when Constantine built his city here. It had been happening when Mehmed's cannon broke the walls. It was happening now, over Fatma's neighborhood and Murad's waterfront and Hafsa's window and the Süleymaniye going up on the hill. It would be happening after all of them were gone. That was the kind of thought that the October light over the Bosphorus produced in people who were paying attention to it. Murad paid attention. He stood at the waterfront with the light on his face and let it happen. Then he went home to write his letter. He wrote more than he had planned. He told his mother that Istanbul had a way of making you feel both very small and very present, both part of something too large to understand and entirely yourself. He said the Bosphorus was extraordinary. He said he thought he was going to be all right here. He sent the letter the next morning with the post rider who went toward Anatolia. He went to the Chancery. He copied the day's documents. He worked on his loop formation. The Chancery chief scribe looked over his shoulder once and said nothing, which was better than saying something, which meant it was almost right. Almost right was progress. Progress was enough. The bread came out of the oven in the morning and was sold by noon. This was the rhythm of Ibrahim and Fatma's life. The night's rise, the morning's baking, the selling, the afternoon, the evening, the sleep, the rise again. 20 years of this, not without pleasure. The satisfaction of a thing done well and consistently is not the satisfaction of the grand gesture, but it is real and it is daily, which makes it more reliable than the grand gesture and in some ways more important. Ibrahim, loading the oven in the pre-dawn dark, was not thinking about the arc of his life. He was thinking about the loaves, the specific batch, the specific heat of the oven, the specific quality of this morning's dough. The long arc took care of itself. The loaves required attention now. This is the way. Not the life in its grand overview, but the life in its immediate specificity, the dough, the oven, the bread, the loaf. The philosophy of craft, that doing the thing well in the specific moment is sufficient. That the meaning is in the doing, not in some retrospective accounting of the doing. Ibrahim knew this without knowing he knew it. Most people who know this know it that way. Fatma counted the day's earnings in the late afternoon, when the stall was closed and she was back in the kitchen of the house with the day's accounting to do. The coins in a small pottery bowl, the copper coins that were the small change of Ottoman daily commerce, the occasional silver coin that was the product of a larger sale. She entered the amounts in the account she kept in her head and occasionally on paper, the running total of what was coming in and what was going out, and whether the household was holding or declining. It was holding. This month it was holding. The grain price was up, which meant the bread ingredient cost was up, which meant the margin was thinner. But the margin was still there. The accounts balanced. The household was stable. She put the coins away. She went to think about dinner. The stability of the household was not glamorous. It was not the subject of poems. It was not the achievement that anyone in Ottoman Istanbul in 1540 would have considered worth celebrating. But it was the thing that everything else rested on: the bread, the school fees for her son's mektep, the fabric for the winter clothing, the occasional gift to Hafsa, the Thursday Hammam, Ibrahim's coffee house. All of it resting on the daily count of coins in the pottery bowl and the continuing decision that the bread price was right and the customers were there and the flour was good and the oven worked. This was the achievement, not celebrated, not visible, daily, sufficient. In the evening, the city's sounds changed key. The commercial noise of the day dropped away, the hammering, the haggling, the vendor calls, the noise of loading and unloading. What remained was the domestic sound of a city arranging itself for the night. The cookshops busy with the evening meal, the coffee houses full of men finishing the day's conversations, the Hammam sending steam into the cool air, the mosque receiving the last visitors for the Isha prayer, the night prayer that closed the day. The Isha came late in October. The dark came early and the prayer came after the dark. And by the time it was done, the city was settling into the deeper quiet that was as close to silence as a city of 700,000 ever got. Fatma and Ibrahim ate dinner together in the kitchen, which was the warm room, the room where the fire had been going all day, and where the heat accumulated in the walls and the floor. They ate the fish that Ibrahim had gotten from the waterfront that morning, the loofah, the autumn bluefish, grilled on the iron grate over the fire with onion and sumac. They ate the bread from the day's baking. They drank water and afterward the mint tea that was the evening's closing comfort. They did not say a great deal. They had been married for 20 years. The conversations that needed having had been had. The silence between them was the productive silence of people who have organized their lives together and who find each other's company sufficient without constant verbal maintenance. Ibrahim said that the bluefish was particularly good this year. Fatma agreed. They had this conversation every October. The night came fully. The city in its October darkness, the Bosphorus reflecting what light there was from the sky, the fires and lamps of the ships moving through the strait like slow-moving stars at the water level, the watchman making his rounds, the call of the Isha from the minarets, and then the silence after. Murad was at his table with his lamp, reading the Fusuli poems that he had borrowed from a colleague at the Chancery, the great Ottoman poet of the 16th century, whose ghazals were in every cultured household, whose particular gift for describing longing in the specific Ottoman literary vocabulary of love and the divine was already recognized as exceptional. He was not a sophisticated reader of poetry. He was a young man who found the poems beautiful without being able to articulate exactly why, the longing in them, the specific combination of the sacred and the personal, the sense that the poem was saying something about experience that ordinary language could not say. He fell asleep with the book. The lamp burned. The Bosphorus moved outside. In the morning he would be at the Chancery. In the evening he would be at the water. In the night the lamp and the poem. This was his life taking shape around him like a city he was still learning to navigate. He was becoming someone in Istanbul in 1540. He did not know who yet. He was patient. The city would show him. The specific satisfaction of a day well managed, the coins counted, the bread sold, the fish eaten, the letter written, the tea drunk, this belongs to no century. The form it takes changes. The transaction that underlies it does not. This is what the city gives you, eventually, if you stay in it long enough. Not answers, not certainty, but the specific comfort of being embedded in something that has been here longer than you have and will be here after you are gone. The Bosphorus will be here, the minarets will be here, the bread will be sold, the fish will run in October, the cats will own the streets. You are part of it. You are not required to be more than part of it. Part of it is enough. Part of it is everything. You are in your bed. The Bosphorus is not outside your window. The call to prayer is not the sound that shapes your mornings. You did not wake to cold floors and banked embers and the smell of a city of 700,000 people beginning its day at the edge of 2 continents. And yet, the bread that you might have on your kitchen counter, baked by someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone, that relationship with the daily loaf goes back further than the Ottoman Empire. The neighborhood that knows you, the shop where someone knows your usual, the particular quality of familiarity that a place acquires when you have been in it long enough, that is Fatma's stall, translated. And the young person who has come to a large city and does not yet fit it, who stands at the water's edge in the afternoon and thinks about home and thinks about what they are becoming. That is Murad, in every generation, in every city that has ever been large enough to be overwhelming. The Hammam on Thursday, the coffee house in the morning, the imam who knows who is sick, the widow at the window who has seen enough to stop being surprised. These are not Ottoman inventions. They are human institutions, the ways that people in dense proximity organize their care for each other, their information about each other, their need for each other. The forms change. The function is the same. Sleep well. And that for tonight is Ottoman Istanbul. Not the sultans, not the palace, not the siege engines and the campaigns, but the bread stall at the corner of the Mısır Sarşısı, and the water carrier with his leather bag and Murad standing at the Bosphorus in October, and the widow Hafsa watching from her window, and the Hammam on Thursday afternoon and the coffee house in the morning, and the Süleymaniye going up on the hill and Sinan solving his structural problem, and the fish coming through the strait in the autumn migration, and all of it, the city going on. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a comment, tell me which of them stayed with you, tell me where you listened from tonight. The subscribe button is nearby if this is your kind of history. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Good night.